Welcome. On behalf of the National Transit Institute, I thank you for participating in the Methods for Forecasting Demand and Quantifying Need for Rural Passenger Transportation Final Workbook CCRP Report 161 webinar. The National Transit Institute develops, promotes, and delivers training and education programs for the public transit industry in the United States. We are pleased to have Frank Spielberg, A.T. Stoddard, and Corey Pitts as our presenters. Mr. Frank Spielberg was the principal investigator for this project. Mr. Spielberg has had a lengthy career in the development and application of travel forecasting methods to the planning and operation of both urban and rural passenger transportation services. He has directed research efforts for TCRP and for FTA. He has directed practical transit planning efforts for both urban and rural systems. Mr. A.T. Stoddard is a principal with LSC Transportation. He was a key participant in the development of the methods described in TCRP Report 161 and an instructor at the state-level training seminars for the rural transit need and demand forecasting methods, and has worked with rural transit systems for over 30 years. He has focused on the development of service plans and enhancing service efficiency for rural transit systems. He has served as a university faculty member and has conducted training workshops for CTAA and many states across the country. Now I will turn the presentation over to Frank.
The project we're going to talk about was TCRP Project B36, which focused on rural passenger transportation. It was a follow-up to an initial project, which was the third project actually funded when the Transit Cooperative Research Program was initiated in the early 90s, recognizing that rural transit was an area that had long been neglected and needed some particular work. TCRP funded Project B3, which was developed methods to forecast demand for rural passenger transportation services. A.T. and I were both fortunate enough to have worked on that project. One of the key problems in developing procedures related to rural passenger transportation is that there is a real scarcity of organized data that can be used for analysis and for building models. In the original B3 project, we collected very detailed data from 39 counties and used that to develop relationships. We then published a workbook somewhat similar to the one that's now available under Project B36 and also put out a spreadsheet and to illustrate how technology changes. We put that out in Lotus 123, which I think nobody uses anymore. The methods were applied by many consultant groups and many states with mixed reviews. Some agencies found them to be perfectly acceptable, giving the answers that were useful. Certainly the thought that goes into applying the methods is always useful for the analysis, but others noted some deficiencies. So about a decade later, in 2005, the Transit Cooperative Research Program authorized Project B36, and we were also, A.T. and I were also fortunate enough to be selected to do that project. That project expanded on the previous work. The previous work had looked only at demand, and this project looks at both need and demand. And as we get into the discussion, you'll see we focus a bit on what the differences are between those two concepts. Also, we were able to draw on national databases. In fact, we were requested to do that rather than specific counties, try to get something that had was felt to have more of a national scope. And also, there were some new travel markets that had emerged in the decade, and we were asked to look at those. So why was it thought that a new methodology was appropriate? Well, the markets had changed clearly in the decade. FTA had promulgated their requirement for the Public Transportation Human Service Coordination Plan. That made it incumbent on many of the agencies to have a good understanding of who the other agencies were that they were working with and what the needs and demands might be for all the markets within their service area. A technological advance was Between 1995 and 2005, the Internet basically became ubiquitously available, and all of a sudden it was possible for anyone in the country to easily access data which previously had required pouring through printed census reports. And then I think there was a continued recognition that when you have good forecasts, both of need and demand, it does provide, and they're based on a nationally recognized methodology, it does provide support for the agencies that are looking for both state and local funding support. Now, in this project, we were able to draw on some much better data sources. One was the ACS, the American Community Survey, which in the first decade of the century replaced the long-form census with all the detailed demographic information, but at a somewhat lower sampling rate, and also the public use microsample that came along with the ACS. And the ACS now is really the only source for disability data, that is disability status data, that is consistent across the nation. It's conducted annually, and then annual 3-year and 5-year summaries are issued periodically. 3-year data covers only those areas that have a population of more than 20,000, and the 5-year data is for all areas, and it goes down to the tract level. So those are some of the data sources we used. We also used the National Household Travel Survey. That's a travel day diary that is sponsored by USDOT. It's collected across the nation for all sorts of types of households. Necessarily, it is a relatively small sample for any particular area, and particularly it's a small sample when you get to rural households. So the data really are valid only when considered for fairly large geographic areas, and in this case, that's census divisions. We were also able to access the Rural National Transit Database, and that actually evolved during the course of the study. And when the initial versions we got of that really did not clearly identify service areas. And the rural NTD, however, does not get into patronage by market. Initially, there were some questions about data quality, and they really are, those data are only covered general public services. They don't get into many of the specialized or program-oriented services that operate in rural areas. The main products of B36, this study, were a workbook for applying the methods. That's the printed report, and there's the links are here on this. There's an Excel spreadsheet for applying the methods, and we're going to talk about that at some length towards the end of this presentation. And then there's a detailed technical report that talks about how we came up with the methods that are going to be discussed, and that's available as a web-only document for people who really want to get into the guts of the data and the methodologies and how they were developed. Now I'm going to turn this over to AT, who will get into a discussion of these methods that are contained in 161.
Great. Thank you, Frank. As Frank mentioned, we have several products from this study. I'm going to focus right now on the printed document, which is also available as the download report 161. And then Corey's going to cover the spreadsheet. We're not going to cover the technical report. That really is very much research-oriented and is available online if you want to know any of the math and the analysis behind what we've done. So let me begin by just showing the contents of the report 161. We start out with a quick start guide. I'm going to show you a little what that covers, and then most of what I'm going to talk about is the methodologies for need and demand and some of the definitions, applicability of the methodologies and where they don't apply, and give you an overview really of that. And so with that, the quick start guide just really outlines basic data required to get started to estimate the need and demand, information about service characteristics, and looking at service area, population, where you serve, the level of service provided in vehicle miles or hours, one-way trips for where you have existing service, and then information about community characteristics. Again, looking at the service area, college and university enrollment. We'll come back to this because that we found is a major factor in a number of areas that are designated as rural, but really are small cities, less than 50,000 population, and the presence of a residential campus can be a big factor in the level of transit demand. We have two methodologies that we looked at for need, and I should get into definitions here in a moment, but we look at population in need, or the number of people who have need for transportation service, and then also the mobility gap, which gives an estimate of the number of trips that are needed primarily by those people who are in that population group that's in need. This is in response to feedback we received that the elected officials and those who make funding decisions really want to know how many people need transportation service, but those who are involved in doing any of the planning for that service also need to have some idea of the order of magnitude of the number of trips that would involve. And so we have those two methodologies. In the area of demand, we looked at 4 markets, and we have multiple methodologies here that we have developed. I'm going to focus on the primary ones for these 4 markets. So the first one is in the area of general purpose rural transportation or rural transit demand. Typically, this is demand response service in those rural areas. We also look at program trips, and I'll give you our definition of that here in a moment. But these are the trips that really are related directly to participation in programs operated by human service agencies. Then the next 2 are areas that were not addressed in the Project D3 or Report 3 under the TCRP. The first 2 are updates to what we had developed in that earlier project. These 2 are completely new markets that we looked at. And so that third bullet is for small city fixed route services, small communities under 50,000 population. So technically rural areas, but we found a number of these that operate some type of fixed route service, and we wanted some type of way to estimate the demand for that. And then the other new market that we looked at is for commuters who are commuting from a rural area to an urban center, and looking at a methodology to estimate that demand for those commuting into urban areas but living out in rural communities. We also have several appendices. Here you can see really these are detailed information. The first, Frank mentioned the 5-year American Community Survey data. There's specific steps for accessing that, and so we provided that in an appendix. Instructions for the spreadsheet, which Corey is going to cover and demonstrate, but we have specific instructions in the appendix for that, and then some suggested guidelines for data collection. I'd like to cover several definitions before we get into the methodologies. These first 2 were really crucial to the development of these methodologies. The first one is a definition of need, and as we've defined it, it relates to transportation that's required by individuals so they can fulfill activities in life, participate in society. An important factor here is that the need is independent of the availability or quality of available transportation. As I mentioned, we did develop 2 methodologies, one focused on people and trips. And then demand is contrasted in that it is the number of trips that would be made using a specific transportation service. So we have a given price, a level of service, and our demand is always measured in passenger trips. So that really the distinction is that the need is related to the people wanting or having a requirement to participate in society, being able to fulfill what we think really are basic functions in life, and need is present whether or not we have a transportation service available, while demand is present only when we do have transportation service. So there may always be need, But if we have no service available, we would have no demand. And as we increase the level of service available, we would anticipate demand increases. And if we increase the price of that or the cost to the user, we would expect then the demand to decrease and vice versa. So those are definitions related to need and demand. Our definitions for trip, trying to be consistent with other definitions, in our methodology, it's a one-way trip. We're looking from a point of origin to point of destination. For our fixed route and non-program or general public trips, we define it as same as the National Transit Database or as boardings. Then for the program or human service agency sponsored trips, it is a linked trip from the original origin to the ultimate destination. Just again, definition of what is rural versus urbanized. Our rural areas are counties with a population density of less than 1,000 persons per square mile. And then our urbanized areas have a density above 1,000 persons per square mile and a total population of at least 50,000. And so, as I said, many of those smaller cities with population even just under 50,000 are classified as a rural area, but in many cases their systems operate much more like an urban transit system, and hence we included a methodology for fixed route service in these small cities. Then a contrast between program and non-program trips. Program trips are those that are really related to the existence and participation in some specific human service or social service activity. And the key factor there is that the trip time and destination is established by the agency so that the participant or the person can take part in that specific activity. The non-program trips are more like general public, although it may include a service that's limited to specific groups. So, for example, there may be a service that provides transportation for seniors, those age 60 or over, but it functions as non-program in that the trip times, destinations, the trip purpose are all determined by the traveler and are not related to participating in a specific program. So our definition, and that then carries over into the methodologies for both program and non-program trips. With those definitions out of the way, I'd like to turn and talk about our methodologies. And so the first one we're going to touch on is the level of need based on population, or the number of persons. And we looked at a number of factors and ended up with determining this level of need based on two characteristics of the population. The first is the number of persons residing in households with income below the poverty line, plus the number of persons residing in households owning no vehicle. Those were really the two most significant factors related to need for transportation service. And as we note on this slide, vehicle ownership we found was more important than age. And this next slide just illustrates that. What you're looking at here is a graph showing the average daily rural household trips, or rural households only. And then by age group, based on the age of at least one household member, and then the ownership of a vehicle in that household. And although the rate at which these households make trips decreases with age, it's a much more significant difference related to the ownership of the vehicle. And therefore, our definition and estimate of the number of people who need transportation service came back to that two factors, the number living below the poverty level, and those in households without vehicles. Then for the trip-based need, we developed a concept that we called the mobility gap. And it really is a gap, or the difference between the trips that people make who have a personal vehicle and those who lack a personal vehicle or don't have access to it. And so really it does represent a full unmet trip need related to those who have relatively unfettered mobility. And I think everyone pretty much can relate to this. Those who have a car that is in good condition can travel pretty much whenever, wherever they want. And so there really is a difference in the number of trips made by those who have vehicles and don't. Our measure is in passenger trips or trips per day. And that third bullet we have there is a very important one, because we need to understand that when this methodology is used, it does provide an estimate of the need for transportation services, but trying to serve all of that unmet need is unrealistic. We can determine an estimate of the proportion of need that is currently unmet, or more importantly, set a goal based on how much of that need you want to meet with transportation services or public transit service. But again, I need to emphasize that while it does indicate the level of need, serving all of that or trying to fulfill all of those needs is not realistic from a cost-effectiveness standpoint. The graph I've shown here just illustrates that gap. And so, again, this is looking at data from the National Household Travel Survey. It shows the number of daily household trips for households with 0, 1, 2 or more vehicles. And that difference, shown by the lines and the arrow as mobility gap, is the difference between those trips made by households with at least one vehicle and the households that have 0 vehicles available. And so that, again, is our definition of the mobility gap shown here in graphic form. The table that you see shows that mobility gap by census region. Again, this is from the National Household Travel Survey in 2009. We used the census regions and could not go to a lower geographic level than that, basically because of the small number of households when you get down to a state level, where there just aren't enough to really have statistical validity. So we had to keep it at the level of the census regions. And you can see here the trips per household per day for the 0 and single vehicle households, and then that gap. So our national average, that mobility gap, is about 1.5. But it really ranges from a low in the Pacific Division, Division 9, 1.1, up to a high in the West North Central Division at 2.1. So you can see there is, and actually the Mountain Division is lower even at 0.8. So there is a real range and difference depending upon the region of the country. So those are our two methodologies for the estimate of need, and both looking at the number of people who have a need for transportation, which is often more important to the local county commissioners or city council. They want to know how many people you're going to serve, but then also a methodology to look at the level of service or the number of trips that might be required to meet the transportation needs of those population groups. So with that, we'll turn to the methodologies for demand, and we'll begin with the general public rural demand methodology. There are really two basic approaches to developing forecasts, and I'll give you information on both of these. The first one is a peer analysis, and then second, a demand function that we found. So in peer comparison, there are a number of sources of data. We've shown these here and give these in decreasing order. First of all, one of the best indicators of changes in demand or what might occur if you were to add service in another part of a community or expand your service area is to look at your own system and look at characteristics of how your system performs and the level of demand that the people that are riding and project from information based on your own system. And then Next would be to look at systems operating in similar rural settings in your state, in your own state, and then look at similar rural settings outside your state. And we break that out initially to look at your own state versus others because there's a wide difference in how states fund rural transit services and the level of funding, and correspondingly then the level of service provided in various rural states and in those communities. So beginning with your own system and then similar communities in your own state and then possibly elsewhere in the nation. As you look at selecting those peers, several things are important. One is just in the area of the operating environment, is looking at the size of the service area, population, square miles, characteristics, even population density. Again, a key one would be presence of a college or university, particularly a residential campus, because again, that can be a major factor in the level of demand on a local rural transit service. Funding sources, again, very important. Some communities have dedicated funding, others don't, and so understanding the differences there and finding systems that at least similar in terms of the type of funding sources that are used would be important. Another factor or area is the degree of coordination. This is much more subjective, but can be a big factor when you look at a local rural transit service. And if it is one that has a high level of coordination or even consolidated services, the demand, the number of riders on that system will be very different from a community where a number of agencies are providing their own client transportation and operating independently. And so it's important to have an understanding of that degree of coordination, and really the only way you can find that is really talking to some of those peer systems. So here are some of the sources of peer data. State Transit Agency typically collects that data. A transit association may have it in the state. Neighboring states may be able to provide it. Frank already mentioned the National Rural Transit Database. Certainly something to look at as a starting point. I think the next one, in calling the other agencies, is probably the most important, because then you can find out information that really doesn't necessarily show up in these other sources. And that's things like how they are funded, what their funding sources are, and particularly that one I had just talked about, the degree of coordination within the system. Then just to mention, for larger systems, this doesn't really apply to most rural, but there's the Integrated National Transit Database Analysis System that's available and will actually help you select peer systems, but that really is for urban systems. For rural systems, you really end up having to do your own research, finding the peers that fit best with your system and how you operate and characteristics of your community. Here is just a list of information needed for the peer systems once you've selected those, and even actually going through this list as you collect data, you may decide to eliminate some of those because you start to look at it, they really maybe aren't that close as they appear. If you want to look at, again, population of the area served, the service area size, do they have that major generator, how much service are they providing, what is the operation? There are obviously distinct differences between fixed route, route deviation, or demand response service, and you would want to be comparing similar types of service if you're looking at them as a peer system. Then the number of one-way trips, and as I've already mentioned, the degree of coordination with other agencies and particularly the human service programs that may be present in those communities. When we look at the demand function, we found really that for rural systems, the demand is a function of three population groups. First is the elderly, and we cut that at a point age 60 and over. The mobility limitation, age 18 to 64, those who are not able to travel outside their home independently in that age group, and then residents of households having no vehicle. And this next slide gives that demand function. So you can see that, again, the non-program or general public type service for rural areas, that demand is equal to 2.2 times our population age 60 and over, and then 5.21 times the mobility limited population age 18 to 64, and 1.52 times the residents of households having no vehicle. And that gives us an indication of the level of demand for that rural general public, usually demand response type service. Then looking at program trips, and I just put the definition up again just to remind everyone that when we talk about these program trips, we really are focused on those trips to participate in some specific program or activity. Some of the examples of these human service programs you can see on this slide. The methodology in Project P3 and given in Report 3 developed some demand relationships for a variety of these human service programs, and as we went back and re-looked at this, we found that there's just so much variation in how these programs function and the culture of communities that the demand functions really did not work very well statistically. There was a very high variance, and just as an example, if you look at the senior nutrition programs, I've been in a number of rural communities where they have a lunch for seniors, typically at a senior center, and in some communities the parking lot is jammed full and everyone drives, and there may be a handful of people that actually ride a vehicle operated by the senior center or by the local transit service. Others ride with their friends, and really the culture is one of people driving. And I've been in other communities where it's just the opposite. The vehicles are filled and people are riding, and that even ends up being part of their social time as they ride together and back from the lunch program. And so the differences from community to community made this really difficult to come up with a good mathematical demand function for any of these. And what we ended up with is really what I would say is a fairly simple approach. What it does require is talking to the administrators of these various human services programs, and just to walk you through, when we look at these program trips, again, those trips tied specifically to participation in a program, that it really is the number of program participants, then the number of events per week. You multiply that by the proportion who attend on any given day or on an average day, because not everyone who's eligible participates every time that program is offered. And then multiply that by the proportion or percentage of those participants that are dependent on transportation service, times the number of weeks per year the program is offered, and we multiply that too to get our one-way trips to and from the program. And so again, mathematically a very simple approach, but requires talking to the folks to get that kind of information. So our suggestion for those who are preparing any kind of coordinated plan for transportation services, obtain that information from each of the agencies to estimate the level of demand. Then our small city fixed route or micropolitan areas, again, those small cities that are outside urbanized areas, the population of less than 50,000 in a county not within an urbanized area. And our methodology, what we found was, again, based on the level of service. So we have a factor times the revenue hours of service, factor 1.07 times the total population, and then 7.12 times the college or university enrollment. And again, these are resident campuses within the community. And then then the final one I'm going to cover are the commuters to urban centers. Where that applies is from a county that is not part of an urbanized area to a county that is in an urbanized area. And it works for commuter trips where that range of trips of all modes between the rural home county to the workplace county is between 2 and 30,000. The transit demand is just proportion to who are using transit for commuter trips from the rural county to the urban place times the total number of commuters, again, times 2 to get our one-way trips. And here are the factors that go into calculating that proportion. So this is, again, a calculation of that percentage of proportion that we would multiply times the total number. And so we've got factors in here, a constant, factor times the workers commuting, and then we subtract that, a factor times the distance. And then, interestingly, we have another factor that is if the urban place is a state capital. There was, again, a statistically significant difference for communities that are state capitals that fall into that category. Sources of the commuter trip data, often the urbanized area metropolitan planning organization travel model, state travel model, possibly the American Community Survey, although the last one, the local employer household dynamics, LEHD, is a primary source of getting that commuter information. So with that, we've covered the methodology, and Corey is going to take over and walk you through the spreadsheet.